find the evening most enchanting, especially as the candles burn low and the final worshippers begin to depart. It's a time when the birds still sing in the trees and the sun gracefully descends, bringing me closest to our Lord, Bishop Julian O'Connor shared, concluding his monologue. He gazed expectantly at Mrs. Maria Cabrini, who wore a somber mourning attire and displayed signs of fatigue with her puffy eyes and a tightly clutched handkerchief, but she didn't respond with the admiration he sought. Maria Cabrini had turned to Bishop O'Connor seeking guidance for her troubled teenage son, Peter. Once a cheerful altar boy, Peter had transformed into a sullen and occasionally violent teenager. As a devoted Catholic widow who had recently lost her husband and was now raising 4 children on her own, Maria had turned to her priest in desperation. Sadly, the widow Cabrini had found no solace in her choice of confidant. Bishop Julian O'Connor, a man of the cloth, was also burdened with pride, excessively fond of his own voice, and more interested in delivering lengthy monologues than genuinely helping his congregation. He had initially addressed Peter's issues but soon digressed into parochial doctrine and condescending moralizing. Now, almost an hour after she had entered O'Connor's parish office, Maria finally heard the conclusion of his lecture. Unfortunately for her, the bishop's musings on evening birds did nothing to address her son's problems. And regrettably for the bishop, the futility of his advice was evident in Maria's persistently worried expression. The aging priest wallowed in his self-absorption as he realized he needed to offer something more to persuade the widow to leave his office. Clearing his throat, he spoke again. "Maria, you've been a devoted mother. Ensure that Peter comes to my office tomorrow evening. I will speak with him, and together we can explore ways to set him back on the right path." With the promise of assistance for her son, Maria Cabrini couldn't contain her emotions any longer and burst into tears. She finally believed she had found the help she sought. She thanked the priest and shook his hand, their handshake lasting for an uninterrupted minute while she sobbed and expressed her gratitude. It took another 5 minutes of praising God and offering reassurances before the old man could finally escort Maria out of his office. As the door closed behind her, Bishop O'Connor sighed with relief, thinking that the woman would never leave him alone. The bishop harbored little compassion for the unenlightened masses he served. As he strolled toward his window, he silently mused, "These people are oblivious to true grace." His parish office overlooked the splendid gardens of St. Joseph's Cathedral, a place that belonged entirely to Bishop Julian O'Connor. His cathedral, his gardens, his realm, and it radiated magnificence. Evening brought the melodious chirping of birds and the rustling of trees in the rejuvenating embrace of spring. Inhaling deeply of the sweet April air, the priest cherished this moment. His sincerity toward the widow's words was undeniable. This was his favorite hour. Bishop O'Connor cast one final glance through his window before turning away. The garden, adorned with blossoms, bathed in the dwindling dusk's glow, the cathedral spires soaring above both oak trees and freshly planted shrubs. The scene was nearly idyllic, but an unsettling presence tainted the sanctity, a sinister secret lurking within this hallowed place, a serpent in the paradise. Beneath the bishop's office window, a man crouched known as Michael McAllister. His physique was unremarkable, bearing the typical appearance of an office worker with a pallid complexion. Yet, appearances deceived, for Michael McAllister was far from ordinary. He was a sinner, among the most egregious kind. Over 3 years in this city, Michael had claimed the lives of 12 individuals. Tonight he intended to take his 13th victim. For 3 weeks he had meticulously observed Bishop O'Connor, unraveling the old man's daily routine and delving into every facet of his life. Michael knew the town of the bishop's birth, the names of his parents, and the seminary where he had received his education. He had even made educated guesses about O'Connor's height and weight. 2 long weeks of relentless vigilance, waiting, watching, and plotting. Throughout his close surveillance of the bishop, Michael discovered one peculiar anomaly. In all this time, he had never witnessed the priest returning home at night, despite knowing the location of the bishop's modest yet elegant colonial house on the town's outskirts. It was a house anyone would be proud to call home, but the old priest was conspicuously absent from it during the night. Instead, when the rest of the clergy had long left the sacred halls of St. Joseph's Cathedral, the bishop would surreptitiously slip back into the grand church. He remained there until dawn, then slipped out through a concealed exit, returning to the parish office as if nothing were amiss. For 2 weeks, Michael had watched this nocturnal ritual, growing increasingly eager to uncover the enigma of the bishop's clandestine activities. As the sun began its descent, Michael found himself amidst the cathedral grounds, surrounded by the departing priests and nuns. He prepared for a lengthy vigil, knowing that Bishop Julian O'Connor was consistently the last to leave his office. Waiting patiently was one of the many qualities he believed distinguished him from other killers. His thoughts shifted to the unsuspecting priest sitting a few feet above him in his office. Despite his self-assured patience, restlessness soon crept in. Michael's eagerness to kill the priest stemmed from more than just his passion for his work. In recent months, a new serial killer had emerged in the same city where Michael had operated for years. This newcomer had garnered the attention and condemnation of the local press by taking the lives of 8 children in just 2 months, leaving their scattered remains scattered throughout the city. To Michael, this new killer's actions seemed amateurish. He had always considered children an easy target. Over the course of his career, he had discovered how simple it was to lure a child into a trap, even right under their parents' noses. Michael was a discerning killer who had developed his own twisted philosophy over the years. He believed that his murders served a greater purpose, targeting those wretched individuals whose arrogance offended him the most: hypocrites, cheaters, and dullards. He saw himself as a refined and selective killer. In reality, these justifications masked the true nature of his crimes, a brutal desire for dominance over others. His resentment towards the child murderer stemmed from a wounded ego. Grieving parents, horrifying headlines, and a terrified public were all accolades that he believed belonged to him due to his superior skills. This resentment occupied his thoughts as he waited, and after a few more hours, the moment arrived. Midnight descended upon the Cathedral of St. Joseph, the Worker. The once singing birds had fallen silent, and the buzzing streetlights cast eerie shadows over the garden. The creaking door of the parish office drew Michael's attention, and he watched as Bishop Julian O'Connor stepped out into the night. The elderly priest locked the door behind him and began his solemn journey towards the imposing cathedral. The hunter lay in stillness, observing his prey's slow progress down the garden path toward the church. When the priest had covered half the distance, Michael discreetly emerged from his concealed position. He quietly trailed the elderly man, maintaining a cautious distance of at least 10 feet. O'Connor remained oblivious to his pursuer's presence, never halting or turning around. A wicked grin crept across the hunter's ordinary features when the priest finally reached the imposing iron-bound cathedral doors. As the priest pulled the double doors open and slipped inside, Michael swiftly advanced, quietly slipping his foot in the door's path. He stood at the threshold, contemplating. In the recesses of his predatory mind, doubts began to surface. He knew it was wise to wait another moment before entering. Alerting the priest prematurely might lead to a struggle, or even his escape. However, Michael brushed aside these hesitations, convinced of his supremacy. In his mind, he was the lion, and O'Connor was merely a lamb. The thought emerged: it's time to deliver the good priest from this unworthy world. With a smile, the killer believed nothing could thwart him, so he pushed the door open and entered the dim cathedral. Although the cathedral was shrouded in darkness, Michael discerned, from the distant silhouette of Bishop O'Connor kneeling before the altar, that his target was still present. His heart raced and his self-control began to slip as the exhilaration of the impending kill took hold prematurely. Michael started to move faster, heedless of alerting his prey. His frenzied footsteps reverberated on the stone flagstones, but he was deaf to the sounds, drowned out by the pulsating rush of blood in his ears. The priest remained motionless, even as the hunter closed in. Michael realized as he neared the priest that he was unusually cold for an April night, but he dismissed the thought and readied his knife. The killer grinned as he prepared to strike the kneeling man, but just as he was about to deliver the fatal blow, a hand gripped his shoulder. Michael spun around, but it was too late. A heavy object collided with his head. Darkness encroached upon the hunter's world. As his consciousness slipped away, he heard faint voices in the distance, though their words remained unintelligible. The last thing he fixed his gaze on before succumbing to blackness was the shadowed space behind the altar. There, where the morning sun would soon penetrate the stained glass, Michael perceived a massive, shifting presence in the obscured rafters. As the hunter stirred from his slumber, he found himself enveloped in an inky darkness. His eyes blinked, instantly detecting that something had been drawn over his head, shrouding his vision. A surge of recollection inundated his throbbing head as he pieced together the events leading to his unconsciousness, and panic began to creep in. Desperately, he attempted to bring his hand to his face to remove the obstructing veil, only to discover that his arms were securely bound. His body sensed the surface beneath him, its vibrations resonating against a cold stone floor as he strained against his restraints. But his efforts proved futile. Though his chest welled with a scream, he suppressed it fiercely, determined not to grant his captors the satisfaction of hearing his fear. The hunter wrestled with the instinctual dread threatening to engulf him, eventually ceasing his struggles and descending into silence. In the ensuing stillness, a voice emerged from the frigid obscurity, resonating with warmth and self-assuredness. It belonged to Bishop Julian O'Connor. "I extend my welcome to our congregation, Michael," the bishop declared. "Though you remain unaware of the reasons, I deem it a divine gift that you grace our temple tonight." At these words, fear surged through the hunter like an overwhelming tide, and a single question consumed his thoughts. How did this priest know his name? Above him he heard a faint movement, and then something brushed against his side. It felt as though tiny, unnaturally cold hands had taken hold of him, one clutching his leg and another latching onto his side. Soon, a larger hand wrapped gently around his throat, an unholy chill encircling him. He nearly succumbed to a scream, but an invisible force seemed to stifle his cries, keeping him silent. The bishop's voice persisted, now adopting a rhythmic cadence and intensifying, as if he were delivering a sermon from a pulpit even now. "You may recall my earlier conversation today with Widow Cabrini," he continued. "It may offer little solace in this moment, but you have spared her son from a dreadful fate." Claws began to gouge into the hunter's flesh, and something long and moist coiled around his legs. The priest carried on, his voice rising in fervor. "Feeble children's forms are unfit vessels for our Lord. The meek have no place upon the earth, which rightfully belongs to the one known as Legion." The probing appendage continued its ascent, winding sensually around his thigh. Michael shivered as icy hands pressed against his skin, while an unseen force tightened its grip around his neck. Suddenly something unsettling surged upward between the hunter's legs, its pulsating warmth grazing his chin beneath the hood obscuring his vision. Amidst this unsettling ordeal, the hidden priest continued his fervent sermon, his voice escalating into a deafening crescendo. "Just as the enemy was born of woman to deceive the feeble, so too shall the Son of the Great Spirit of the wasteland be born of man to bring deliverance to the faithful." With these words, the priest concluded his sermon, and an eerie chant emanated from the darkness. A cold dread enveloped Michael as the alien growth slithered beneath his hood, tenderly caressing his face. Despite his valiant struggles against his restraints, the slimy, probing appendage found its target. It grazed his lips before, in an instant, it forced its way into his throat. Desperation welled within him, but it was too late. The intruding growth had blocked his windpipe, relentlessly pushing downward. Tears welled in Michael's sightless eyes, and a kaleidoscope of visions flooded his mind. He witnessed a man, broken and bloodied, crucified atop a hill at twilight. A serpent with a lion's head coiled around the suffering figure, whispering an offer that was accepted. Unfathomable beings from beyond the stars, known as archons, paraded before him at the behest of a cryptic voice. Then he saw the faces of his past victims, each a sacrifice to his own burgeoning power. As the invasive entity filled his insides with a nauseating churn, Michael grasped that he was no longer the hunter. He had encountered a higher force, and he was simultaneously its quarry, its consort, and its most devoted acolyte. Once more, Michael attempted to scream, but his lungs yielded no sound. Yet it hardly mattered. He had discovered his own peculiar form of salvation,